In the last video, we talked about isolating your RF energy so that people outside your building or in areas of your building that you don't want them to have access, they don't have access. However, doing that might cause some problems. Now that you've limited the power and changed the direction of your RF energy and so forth, now you might have areas inside the building that don't have the coverage that you need. So what can you do about that? Well, directional antennas is one way we can do it, and we've seen that in the previous video, so I'm not going to dwell on that. Another thing that we can do are wireless repeaters, wireless extenders, overlays, and mesh systems. Now, our textbook only covers the first three, and I don't think it really does a wonderful job of explaining the differences between them. So let's talk about the differences between these four things: repeaters, extenders, overlays, and mesh. I've put a table together here. This is not in your book. This is a little extra from me. These areas here that are shaded are some of the ones that have the most important differences between them. So let's take a look at what these are. First of all, a wireless repeater does exactly what it sounds like. It simply rebroadcasts the Wi-Fi signal it receives from the router. Very typically, though, the difference with a wireless repeater is that it creates a new SSID. So for example, if your SSID is home, it might say home EXT or something like that, or home 1 or home 3, some designation other than your SSID. And it may be difficult for your devices to roam seamlessly from one to the other. And these down here are likely the cheaper but easier to install options. Up here we have more expensive and a little more sophisticated options. Now here's another one that is important. Bandwidth for wireless repeaters is often halved. In other words, now you're going to cut your speed of your internet connection or your network connection down to maybe half of what it was without the repeater. So it does get you better coverage, but it may slow you way down. And as we mentioned a little bit ago, seamless roaming, no, devices are going to have a hard time moving back and forth and switching between networks. Now, as far as coverage, though, it can extend coverage to small areas or dead zones, maybe your garage or a corner of the house in a bedroom that doesn't normally get good reception. However, it will be slower reception, but at least it will be workable. Small homes, specific dead zones, and so on. Budget-friendly solutions. The backhaul, in other words, do you need to wire it? No, you don't need to wire it. You just set it up, plug it in, and go. The scalability is quite limited. Adding more repeaters causes more interference and makes it even slower. As far as advanced features, you don't really have any advanced features with it. So that's a wireless repeater. Now let's look at a wireless extender. First of all, we can use the same SSID as the router. So unlike the wireless repeater, which you created separate SSID, these things can create another access point on the same SSID, the same network name. They do have better performance than repeaters. Do they seamlessly roam? Yes, if they're configured with the same SSID, they will roam pretty well. They extend coverage to larger areas, placement flexibility with wired backhaul. So in other words, you can wire these. You can use Ethernet cabling to place the extender. And so that's one reason it doesn't have the speed like it did back here, so it has better performance. So large homes, areas needing better coverage. The backhaul, it can be wired or wireless. If they're wired, it's a little more efficient. As far as scalability, yeah, you can add more extenders, but you have to be careful to place them in a way that they will not interfere with each other on channels. And some models support dual band or even tri-band for better performance, and that's because the RF signals are not now interfering with each other. Now let's look at the wireless overlay. Now this is a little different in that you're not buying a repeater or an extender. You're simply adding another wireless router. In other words, say you have an old spare wireless router at home, and you could take that into your garage. By the way, this is exactly what I'm doing right now in my home. My garage is not getting a good signal from my wireless router that's inside. It's a separate outbuilding, and so it just doesn't get the signal. Well, I ran a cable across the roof and then into the garage, and I just took an old wireless router that I had and I set it up with the same SSID and the same password and use it as an extender. It works fine. You can use it that way. The performance, well, iffy, right? Depends on the quality of the access points and the backhaul connections. Right now, I'm only using a Category 5 cable, so I'm not getting full speed out of that one that's in the garage, but it's sufficient to do what I need it to do. Yes, it does roam nicely. I had guests who were staying in that room out there, and they were roaming back and forth just fine with their phones. You can cover fairly large areas this way. Of course, you do have that cable going back and forth because this is a wired backhaul. In other words, you're wiring from one to the other. They are very scalable in that you can add as many wireless routers as you want. And of course, advanced features depends on the routers that you use. The last option is the most sophisticated wireless mesh systems. So these are advertised out on Amazon and so forth. They're easy to find. These are multiple units. They actually have very high performance, seamless roaming, whole home or large area coverage, wireless or wired backhaul. So mesh units can be wireless to your router or wired to your router. If you can, you want a wired version of it. The scalability, very high. You can add additional nodes as you need to cover the area that you want to cover. And usually these are very intelligent. You can have a lot of advanced features. So just to summarize, a repeater or an extender is a simple device that you put in place to repeat the signal. A wireless overlay is a second router to which you give the same SSID and password, and a mesh is a set of devices that you purchase together and may or may not be connected by Ethernet. Now let's look at some ways that these mesh units can be connected, and I've got a diagram here. The main unit wirelessly connected to the router, that's not what I have here, by the way. This would be wirelessly connected to the router, and this is the master unit. And then the child unit's wirelessly connected or talking to the master unit. Now what I do have here is what I prefer. This is, I think, a better setup where the main unit is wired to the router and a child unit is wirelessly talking to the master. So here we have an Ethernet connection here to the wireless router, and then the child unit's talking to the master. We can have a wired connection to the wireless router, and then the child units are Ethernet connected to the master unit. In other words, these are wired to the master unit like that. Now, one thing we would not do or would rarely do would be to have these child units daisy chained. In other words, maybe an Ethernet connection here, an Ethernet connection to this child, and then from that child, an Ethernet connection to that child. We would not typically do it that way because that does cause some latency issues and degrading of our speeds.